How's everybody? Pernak here, and I'm going to talk to you today about the different types of ink you can use in relief printmaking. So there's several different types out there. We have our most basic water-based, oil-based, water-soluble oil-based, which is a little bit more recent in the last few years, soy-based oil, also rubber-based, and Japanese paste style. These are the ones I'm going to talk about today with you. So the first type of ink we're going to look at is water-based ink. It's the one by far most printmakers are familiar with. It's the one that most people get started with. So there are a few brands that do make this. The one that is by far the most popular, at least in the United States, is going to be your Speedball brand inks. They're water-based, like I said. Probably an acrylic or something that they don't really tell you much about what they make them out of. But the brands that are going to be the most popular is in America is going to be your Speedball, and then Blick Art Materials also makes their own brand, which almost looks identical to this. Probably is made by Speedball for them. Who knows? One of the other brands, Esty, which is an English company, and I didn't even know they made things like printmaking inks. I knew them as scratch board or scratch paper makers who make a really good fine quality scratch paper. For those of you who aren't familiar with scratch paper, you can take that a look at etching board. It's not etch board, but scratch board and things like that. You can look at it. It's basically you take a metal nib pen kind of that's got a sharp end and you just scratch into this black board, and it's got white underneath and reveals. It's very much like printmaking when you really think about it. And then the other one is Schmenka, which is a German company. I have not used their ink. I would like to because I've heard really good things about it. It's just I don't know anyone in the United States that carries it or even how easily it is to get it. I don't think it's going to be a real easy thing to get. But I have used their gouache, which is really amazing. I love their gouache. And their watercolors, which are really good too. So let's take a look at what water-based is. I mean, it's a water-based product. It says pigment and whatever binder they're using, which is probably some form of an acrylic is what I would assume. I don't know. And then it just dries by evaporation. So all the water that's inside of here is just going to evaporate out and then leaves a paint film behind. And that's really how it works. So what is the pros to this stuff? Well, it's inexpensive. It's readily available. I mean, places like Michael's and Hobby Lobby carry water-based printmaking ink is by far the most popular ink out there for even printmakers to get started with. It's decently inexpensive compared to most other inks, and it dries quick, so you can do multiple layers real quickly, which is one of the nice things about it, and it cleans up with soap and water. So those are the pros to it. Now the cons. Let's look at the cons. They often dry way too quick, though, in my opinion, when you're inking up. You put some ink on your plate and you're using your Baron, and it often dries way too fast for you to be able to really use it very well. So how do you combat that? Retarder. You just get some retarder. Now, let's see here. I know some retarder. You can use just a retarder like this one from Speedball. This is from their Printmasters line, which I believe they no longer manufacture, but they do make a retarder that's in this line. The only difference is just the size. Or you can even use acrylic retarder. This one from Golden will work very well too. So that's the con to it, is it dries way too quickly while you're using it. Plus, the pigment load is often, in my case, I find it to be lacking. It doesn't have very much pigment in them, and that's why I don't really like them, especially with this Blick and the Speedball brands. I can't talk about the Esty, and I can't talk about the Schmenka. The only Esty I've ever seen here in the United States always seems to be in like little printmaking kits that they have. Alright, the next ink we're going to look at is oil-based ink. It is by far, most people who are professional printmakers or getting into printmaking who are a little bit more serious about it. I should say serious printmakers, not just professionals, but people who are serious about it tend to use oil-based inks. At least that's what they used to use the last 10 to 15 years, especially the last 10 years. It has really changed in what inks people use, but traditionally it used to be oil-based inks. And there's a lot of brands out there. I mean, you have Daniel Smith. This is my favorite brand. Unfortunately, Daniel Smith no longer makes inks. And the reasoning for this is simple. No one wants to buy their inks. That's the problem. And when I say no one wants to buy it, you have individual customers who want to buy it, but you don't have any large retail chains or any large companies that sell volumes of ink that want to carry Daniel Smith brand inks. Also, it's very expensive to produce. Most people don't realize it. When I worked at Daniel Smith, it was our least profitable item was printmaking inks. Even though it's the item that Daniel Smith got started with, because he loved printmaking and he wanted to make his own inks, was the printmaking inks were by far the least profitable of any item that he has. And then you also have Gamblin, which is another brand. This one's made in Portland. And this is just their, most of these inks do come in cans like this. Like so. And they got this one just has a glassine, come on, ink skin on the top. I'm not going to sit here and dive into it because it's just too much work. But a lot of them do come in cans like that. There's a few brands, other brands out there. So let's say Daniel Smith, Gamblin, Charbonnel, which is French, Cranefield, that's an English brand, Graphic Chemical, Hanco, and Speedball. Speedball does make an oil-based ink. Most people don't realize this. It's in a small little tube, somewhat similar to this, even smaller. I highly do not recommend buying it. I've used it, and it is stringy and clumpy, and it's not very good. Out of all the brands, I just do not like it. I tried it once and said no. That was the good thing about working at Daniel Smith. I got to try a lot of different brands when I could. So, oil-based inks are made from, typically, at least Daniel Smith, the way they did it, was linseed oil. And linseed, and one of the benefits of linseed oil or oil-based inks is they don't evaporate. There's no water inside oil, because water and oil don't mix, so you have no water in it. So unlike water-based inks, which evaporate, the water comes out of the paint film, that doesn't happen with oil-based inks. How do they dry? They emulsify is the process that they use. Basically, oxygen hits the ink, or it hits the oil, and hardens it. It actually turns it from a liquid to a solid. So it hardens the ink through a chemical reaction of oxygen hitting it, actually changing the form of it, and it creates a tough surface. Now, in oil painting, which also uses most linseed oils and other types of oils, the thicker your ink, the longer it will take to dry. So, printmaking typically isn't that thick compared to paint layers, but you can speed up that process too. Let's see here, what do my rest of my notes here say? So what are the pros of oil-based ink? Well, for it's got a longer open time. So when you put it on your plate, you can use it. I mean, I've found myself, I can leave it out for like over a day and still go back to it and reuse the ink. It doesn't dry that quickly, unless I use a dryer with it. If I use a dryer with it, I clean it up right and quick. They have a much higher pigment load than any of your water-based ones. They're layable. Like, when I say layable, you can put print layers on top of layers, which is another nice thing about them. And you can do that with the water-based ones too, but since they're thicker pigment loads, they tend to cover better. What is the downside? They're difficult to clean up since it's oil. You can't use soap and water to clean them. Most people will use something like... I had a little bottle of it somewhere over here. It disappeared. Gamsol which is what a lot of people will use. I think I got some in here. Yeah, Gamsol. Right here. Or mineral spirits or anything like that, paint thinners, those types of things are what you're going to use. Gamsol is the one I highly recommend the most. It is by far the one because it is this stuff does evaporate so quickly. This one evaporates the slowest, which means you breathe in the least amount of harmful chemicals. Do you still breathe them in? Yes. And it is odorless, so you don't really smell it either. That's the other downside to it. But you can also use vegetable oil and simple green. So you just take you coat everything in vegetable oil with a brush, kind of scrub it out, and it loosens up all the ink and everything. And then because vegetable oil is more easily cleaned up than linseed oil with soap and water, you just use some soap and water or linseed oil, and that will clean everything up. And that's really the only downside to oil-based inks, is that they're very difficult to clean. And that's why I don't like using them. Most people don't, but occasionally you do need to. The next ink I want to talk about is water-soluble oil-based inks. Now, they sound like an oxymoron, and they kind of are, but they're not. Water-soluble oil-based inks have been around for a while, but they were never that good. And basically what it is it's a chemical that is added to the oil, and that chemical bonds with the oil. So you have the chemical molecule and the oil molecule, and they bond together. Now these new molecules are attracted to each other, so they like to stick to each other, and that's why it acts like an oil. With the exception of when you introduce water and soap and things like that to it, it breaks it apart and causes it to lose its molecular bonds, and they break apart, allowing you to clean them up with soap and water. Now, the early versions of this ink, or anything involving this, were okay. Let's see here. One of the early versions was like, most people don't realize this, but the Speedball Textile ink came out before many of the others, along with Winsor Newton's, what was it? Winsor Newton's water-soluble oil paint. I never really liked either of those products, and I gave them a try when they came out, and they were just, I don't like them. They're gummy. They feel gummy, and that's the problem. It's like trying to play with gum. It's trying to ink with gum or paint with gum. They got this weird drag on them. I just never really cared for them. But it seems like within the last few years, it seems like in the last 10 years, I would say, they came out with a someone came out with a new version of this chemical, which allows it to act and retain more of the characteristics of oil. It's not gummy anymore. So it worked really well. So a lot of these products have been on the rise lately because people have discovered, because a lot of people started using the very first entries into it and are like, it's not that good. And so when they started, more companies a couple years later or half a decade or whatever it was started coming out with these products, a lot of people were kind of hesitant to use them because they felt the gumminess of the previous ones, and they're like, oh, these are just going to be the same. But once you actually gave them a chance, you realize, oh, they act just like oil-based inks for the most part. Almost like oil-based inks. They're pretty damn close, is what I'll say. So what brands make these? So, like I said, Speedball makes one. They make a professional version, which has been out for about 3 or 4 years, I would say now. I can't remember when it came out. Like this one right here. This is their yellow one. They make a good, decent amount of colors. Couple reds, couple yellows, a couple blues, a green, a purple, white, black, all their standards. I got started with Daniel Smith, which of course, like I said, they don't make ink any longer just because it's not profitable for them to make ink, because no one wants to carry said brand of ink, which is why they don't make it. But yeah, this is one you can easily find in the United States very much. Another one that's been getting a lot of rave reviews. I know a lot of people love it. I see these from all over the Reddit boards and things, is Cranfield's Calico water-soluble inks. I haven't tried them yet. I would like to, but I haven't tried them. Another one I have tried, though, is Charbonnel's. This is a little test tube that they gave me a while back. Come on! Zooming on my hand. No. Oh well. Charbonnel. I am sitting here trying to get this to focus, and it's just not focusing that well. This is just a little sample. Like I said, this is a sample tube. But it's Charbonnel's Aqua Wash. It's a little thicker than some of the other brands, mostly because it's meant to do double duty between Intaglio, which is any kind of etchings, engravings, and that kind of stuff, and relief. If you're going to use it for relief, I recommend a drop or two of their Aqua Wash oil and mixing up the ink, which will loosen it up a little bit and allow it to roll out better, which is the one that I like. And let's see here. Who else makes one? No, that's it. It's basically your Daniel Smith, your Cranfield, your Speedball professional and textile versions. So, what are the pros of this ink? Well, it acts like oil-based ink, which is what's good. That's why people like it. So it's got a long open time. But it also cleans up with soap and water, which is one of the reasons people like it. I personally use glass cleaner. I like this. It works so much easier. I don't even have to take things and, like, if I clean off one of my blocks or something here, I don't have to put soap and water all over this thing. I just put a couple sprays of this, let it sit for about 10 seconds, and wipe it off with a paper towel, spray it once more, go over it again with a paper towel, and I'm done. I don't even need to go to the sink, which is one of the reasons I like using that stuff. What's another benefit? Just because it's like, it acts like water-soluble oil, or I'm not saying it acts like water-soluble oil, it acts like oil. You use all of the same modifiers that you would use for the oil-based products. So your tack reducers and all that stuff, like my Miracle Gel Reducer, or your Easy Wipe, or your Sets Well. I mean, yeah, you could use this. You don't need to. I mean, some people do use this to clean it down, but you would just use the water instead of this. Also, I use my cobalt dryer all the time, you know, to speed up the drying process, just like I do in oil-based things. So, and you can actually mix the two together. So you can mix oil-based inks, I've done it before, and water-soluble oil-based inks, and mix them together, and you get no bad results. The only downside is, if you do so, your water-soluble oils now lose their water miscibility because there is not enough of the water miscible oil-based ink product, chemical, new chemical, whatever it is, to wash out. So it's acting more like oil at that point. Well, it depends on how much you use of oil added to it. If you add a little bit of oil to it, you could probably still clean it up. But it can change its water miscibility issues. Downsides. Let's see here. It dries even slower than water-soluble, or than oil, because the chemical that they use, they add to the oil, actually slows down the emulsification process. That it hinders the oxygen hitting the oil and emulsifying it. It still does it. It just takes a little longer to do so. I find myself, if I've ever done anything with watercolor, like you can print these, and once it dries and completely sets, you can do watercolor over it. You just can't do that if they're wet. It just bleeds out and runs because it doesn't work that way. So you can't do watercolor over it until it's completely set, which means you have to probably wait a couple weeks, you know, for it to completely set. Other than that, the only other downside is some climates, especially your really hot, humid, dry climates, it does like to dry out faster on your plates. So the only thing you can really do, and this is the chemist at Daniel Smith told me this, acrylic retarder. Just use a little acrylic retarder, put a couple drops in it, mix it up, and it'll keep your ink from drying out. You know, every couple hours, maybe you add a little. All right. The third type of ink that I'm going to talk about is soy-based inks. And in the artist realm, that's basically Ukiyo-e. They make two versions of this. I only have one with me because I don't use the other one. This is their Talio, which is basically their etching one, which comes in a little jar. It's really thick. And they also have one that comes in like little bottles that look like this retarder, and it's called liquid pigment. And they're both soy-based oils. It was created by two artists who had children, or they were two artists that were printmakers, and then they had children, and they didn't, and as most people know, most of the inks at the time were they're hazardous because cleaning up oil-based inks involves chemicals, and they didn't want their children exposed to all of that. So they created this. So basically the two differences, like I said, one was a liquid pigment. It's really liquid, and this one is really thick. So the liquid pigment, I know a lot of people use it for monoplates. Yeah, they'll squirt it onto things and paint with it and do all sorts of things and make model prints with it. It's also found a use with Japanese woodblock printers too, because it's so thin and so heavily pigmented. They'll use that, use a little bit of nori paste and mix them together to create the mons for Japanese wood style printing. I know that I've seen Molly Hashimoto, if you're familiar with her as an artist. She will do some, I think she's even written a book on it, and she uses that for her Japanese style printing. Let's see here. So recently though, like within the last, I would say 5 years, Speedball, I mean you can see it here, it says Speedball on it, recently bought out Ukiyo-e. And when they did do that, my first thoughts were, because I was like, well, there goes the neighborhood for it. And then we got, when I was working at Daniel Smith, we got on our first couple batches of it. And I was like, I need to try it. I have to try it and see if it's the same. It's actually better. Speedball improved the formula. One of the things that this ink was notorious for is separating. It was artists who were making this, and they really didn't go through and formulate a lot of things. They really needed a chemist to do things and figure out the proper things, because one of the things is they probably use the same amount of pigment and the same amount of oil for every color. So some colors separated, so you had all this pigment settle to the bottom and then the oil went to the top. It was still oiled down in the bottom, but it's just, that's what ended up happening. If you're not using the right amount of oil, that happens. If you use too much oil, it separates out like that. You can see that in many versions of paint, in other inks. That will happen. It will separate. Doesn't mean there's not anything wrong with it. There's nothing bad. It just needs to be mixed back up. So it did seem like Speedball improved the formulas. They made everything better. You still get a few that do separate out, and I think that's because they're heavy pigments. Especially really heavy pigments tend to settle more. So they're like the metallic ones definitely settle. That's just the nature of those pigments, and you're not really going to get away from it. So let's talk about benefits. Well, it's non-toxic, with the exception of pigments. Now, they could use toxic pigments in this. As far as I'm aware, there are no toxic pigments. So it's a non-toxic ink, which is really nice. It cleans up with soap and water, which is a really nice thing about it. So non-toxic, so it cleans up with soap and water. On the other added benefit, and which is why it's really popular with monoprinters monoprinters, making monoplates and all sorts of things, is because super duper extra long open time. In fact, I could leave this jar probably sitting out for 10 years and it won't dry. Why? Because the soy-based oil doesn't dry. And so you're asking yourself, if it doesn't dry, how am I going to print with it? Well, you have to realize you have to be careful with this stuff, and you have to understand it is a little different. Can you do layers and layers? Yes, I have. I've done a couple of dry points. I did a 5-color dry point to illustrate to people how this one works. It does work, but it dries by absorption. So all the oil absorbs into the paper, and that's how it works. The downside to that is if you use too much oil or too much ink, sometimes you can get little halos. And you can kind of see that when you look at the back of this paper. See that little oil halo there? When you look at the front, you don't see it, but it's definitely on the back. That will happen on the front with this stuff. If you're not careful, if you use too much ink, it will create a halo effect. And if you use too much ink, it's probably not going to dry either. So it does take a really long time to dry too. That's the other downside to it. So basically the oil absorbs into the paper and leaves the pigment on there. There's not really any film there to protect the pigment, so it's kind of just more or less sitting on the paper. So it can still be wiped off if you put enough pressure on it, and that is the downside to it. It does take trial and error to learn this because it is a different type of product. So if you're going to use it, be careful with it. I mean, I had one customer I sold this to, and it works great, and I love this stuff. And she wanted something that was easy to use and clean up, and this is what she ended up choosing. Or this is what I ended up selling to her. She ended up coming back and ended up buying this junk. But that was because I didn't know what she was doing for her process. She was printing, and then once it dried, she was taking colored pencil and doing white highlights in it, which I think is just kind of a lazy way of doing it. But, instead of designing for those white highlights or printing those white highlights, she just chose to do them with a pencil on each one of her prints, which I did not like that much. But, so she couldn't put other types of products over top of it. It just didn't work for her, so she couldn't draw on top of it like you could with a water-soluble one or oil-based one once they dry, because it doesn't really, like I said, it doesn't really dry. Now, if it's just a piece of artwork we're putting behind glass, this stuff works great. But if it's going to be something you're going to touch and handle, maybe a card, business cards, birthday cards, Christmas cards, whatever it is, I wouldn't use it. All right. So one more that we're going to look at ink is rubber-based inks. Now, I have no experience with rubber-based inks, mostly because they're popular with the letterpress community. It seems to be a letterpress thing. Maybe an offset lithography press type of thing too, I think I read. But they're very popular with the letterpress community. And why is that? Well, they got a really long open time, longer than longer than oil-based inks. Not as long as Ukiyo, but no one's going to be using Ukiyo for letterpress. And also, they have their ink tends to be more flatter than glossy, which is one of the reasons some people like it. So using things for letterpress like business cards and all those types of things that you might use letterpress for, it's really popular for that. And because it's normally a letterpress community thing, and these are letterpress shops that do professional work on, to sell to someone for wedding invitations or business cards, they often need large runs. So using an ink that will eventually dry but takes longer on the plate to dry is a really good thing. I don't really know of any cons other than it takes longer to dry. And there's only one brand that I can really find that I'm familiar with, and it's Van Son. They're the only one I can really find, and they were the only one I was ever familiar with. When I worked at Daniel Smith, I'd have people asking, I want rubber-based ink for a letterpress. I'm like, I don't carry it. Why not? Because I don't carry it. People who want to do it this themselves would come in all the time asking for rubber-based ink. I'm like, just use the oil-based stuff. It will still do the same thing. But they just, because they saw one person use a rubber-based, they had to use it. But yeah, there's nothing wrong with rubber-based inks. They're good quality inks from what I understand. I've just never used them because I'm not a letterpress person. Plus, I don't, you can see in my little tiny studio, I don't have a letterpress in here. So it really doesn't help me to have one. So, I mean, I have no point in owning the ink, but I've heard good things about it, and I know a lot of letterpress people who do use it and enjoy it. The last ink I want to talk about is Japanese paste ink. It's really not so much an ink, more than making your own ink. Most of the traditional Japanese woodblock printers who live in Japan make their own inks. And they make them from a set selection of colors typically, just because that's what was available. But according to David Bohl, and those of you who do not know who David Bohl is, he is a British man who lives in Japan and owns a printing company that prints traditional woodblock type prints in Japan. He's made many YouTube videos, and those of you who may or may not be familiar with him, he works with Jed Henry. And Jed Henry has done the series of Ukiyo-e Heroes. Those of you who aren't familiar, it's basically a bunch of video games, characters and scenes and things like that that are recreated in a Japanese, I wouldn't say style, but it is Japanese style. They're traditional woodblock prints in that era of woodblock printing from a couple hundred years ago of video game characters and things. They're very popular. But he talked about his ink. And he goes, basically, I just take a little alcohol, some pigment, and water and mix it together and create a paste. And then when he's ready, he takes that paste, puts it in a little cup, and then adds water to it. And then they will use a little bit. Do I have my nori paste? I don't have my nori paste. I don't know where my nori paste went. Then they'll use nori paste, which is a rice paste. It's a glue, basically. They add a little bit of that to it to act as a binder to help keep it adhered to the page. If you're really interested in Japanese woodblock printing, I recommend looking up David Bohl. He knows a lot about it. I was going to say, there isn't, because most of it is traditionally made, there aren't a lot of companies that make these paste ready to go. In fact, I could only find one, which is Holbein, which is a Japanese company, and Holbein is a fine manufacturer of fine art materials. They make good quality products. Their watercolors are excellent, their gouache is excellent, their acrylic gouache is excellent. They make, their oil paints are really good, their water-soluble oils are really good. They are probably like the only real, as far as I'm aware, professional, wide scope art company out there. Like your Winsor Newton, like your Sennelier, and par with those companies that make professional paint and inks. They do make a set of them. The only place I've been able to find them is McLean's, but if you want to give it a try, they do have them. They're little bottles of pre-mixed paste. You can use them and follow the instructions on printing traditionally. Alright, so that's it for inks and the different inks, at least the ones I'm familiar with. There may be others out there, and if you guys know of something, you can always post it down below and let me know. But I hope you guys learned something. I hope that you enjoyed this. So always, give me a little thumbs up, like my videos. You can subscribe to me down below. Also, if you want to hear more from me and when I do my videos. You can also follow me on my Instagram, Twitter, or Tumblr, which the links are down below or up in the little corner up there. And you can also visit my Etsy shop if you would like to buy a print from me and help support me that way. Until next time, everyone. See ya. Bye.